As a child, Tooke lived in one of the great cities of iron and stone, where he would climb the tall, angular towers and marvel at the ability of man to tame nature. The browns and greens of the nearby wildwood had been supplanted by grey buildings and the blood-red banners of the state, with their enigmatic symbols, providing a uniformity that young Tooke found reassuring. A kind boy, he enjoyed helping those around him, even when he gained nothing in return, for he was innocent and naive. His parents were poor, but he loved them dearly, and he cared little about his prospects for the future, which seemed a long way off. For decades, the state had routinely tested all children for certain qualities, and when Tooke was shown to excel in these tests, the state offered to adopt him, for they always needed workers, and molding them from a young age suited their ends best. Tooke's parents, jobless, penniless, and facing eviction from their small home, knew the only future they could offer the 7-year-old boy was a bed on the streets with the other forgotten citizens, and probably an early death from disease or malnutrition. So with heavy hearts, they agreed to sign over all parental rights to the state. They did this for the very best of reasons, love. But the child couldn't understand why his mother and father had given him away, and when he walked into the towering grey monastery where he would spend the next few years of his life, a part of him died forever. Over the following decade, the powerfully built young man was trained in mind and body, learning to fight with weapons and to battle wits with even the brightest of heretics. Tooke learned to love no one and nothing other than the state and its religion, both of which were built on uniformity and obedience. He honored and respected his tutors, particularly old brother Johannes, who taught him the secrets of alchemy and became first a mentor and then a friend. His religious zeal impressed the Supreme Council, even more than his obvious intelligence, for unconditional acceptance of God's word was the perfect way for the state to control the people. They knew Tooke's fanaticism could be exploited. When he turned 17, he was drafted into the feared Inquisition, a role for which he was perfectly suited. At first, the brutality of his new position shocked and frightened Tooke, but over time, he became desensitized to the prisoner's suffering, for he knew he was doing God's work. He was merely the state's tool, just as the red-hot poker, or the rack, or the skinning knife were his tools. The men and women brought to him by his superiors were sinners, who had transgressed against the state. They deserved the agonies inflicted upon them in his incense-filled interrogation chamber, far beneath the stone streets. However, the state's issued incense made Tooke's eyes water, so he began experimenting with herbs and alchemical formulae, crafting various powders of his own to burn. One of these, with a high concentration of dried Amanita muscaria, awakened a hitherto unknown power in Tooke, who, inhaling the smoke deeply, realized he could for a short time cast his mind outside of his body and sense people in other rooms, even if they were not visible to him. With this new weapon, he would go out into the city hunting for sinners. Many would-be rebels and their families were arrested over the years as a result of Tooke's newfound ability. One morning, a prisoner was brought to him, and Tooke was shocked to see his old mentor, Brother Johannes, in chains, face bruised and bloody, ready for question. Johannes was by now in his 90s, and Tooke had always believed completely loyal to the state. What crimes could this feeble old man be guilty of to end up here, surrounded by incense and implements of torture? Sedition was the charge. The abbot said he was part of a secret network of spies, passing information back and forth in a foolish attempt to foment rebellion. Tooke was ordered to extract Brother Johannes' secrets as soon as possible. The accusation was obviously false, and for the first time in his life, Tooke found himself questioning the state. If they could be wrong about Brother Johannes, they might have been wrong about dozens of other prisoners he had questioned over the years. There was nothing for it, though. He had God's work to do, and with an unaccustomed heavy heart, he set about the business of extracting whatever information he could from his old friend. Every scream from Brother Johannes twisted a knife in Tooke's own guts, but mercifully, the elderly alchemist's heart gave out quickly. He had proclaimed his innocence until his very last, shuddering breath. And as he expired, Tooke felt another change come over him. Whatever the reasons for this abomination, the state were not the infallible, loving protector he had believed. The state were just men, like any other, with their own failings, scheming to their own ends rather than doing God's work. From then on, Tooke recognized the innocence in many of the people he was tasked with questioning, and he knew what he was doing was evil. The Inquisition was evil, and so, by extension, was the state. He could not be a part of it anymore. The state did not just let people leave, though, and Tooke knew that his own thoughts would be considered seditious. He would be arrested and brutally questioned by one of his own Inquisition colleagues, ending up either dead or a mere mindless husk. The only way to survive was to make his way outside the city gates to a place he'd never been before, even as a child, the Greenwood. So taking a loaf of bread, his censer, and a few pouches of his own prized incense, he waited until the night fell and made his way through the streets, taking care to avoid patrols, for even a friar could be stopped and questioned if found outdoors at this time. Reaching the city gates, he crouched in the gloom, breathed deeply of the incense, and cast his mind ahead. To his dismay, the gatehouse was heavily guarded, even at this late hour, and although he was a skilled fighter, there were far too many soldiers to attempt overpowering them all. He had lost his faith in the state, but not yet in God. Looking to the sky, he prayed for a sign, for some means of escape. It was provided in a surprising manner. As he stood in the shadows by the city wall, he noticed a patch of green where there should have been none. Ivy had somehow taken root and grown thickly all the way up the wall. Never had he seen such a thing, for the state frowned on nature and cut it down whenever it encroached into the city. Yet now, miraculously, it offered Tooke a way outside, into the green. Before fear could hold him back, he scrambled up the foliage, trying not to look down, for the walls were high, and at last, sweating and breathing heavily, the defector stood on the thick grass of the forest. Then he began to run, not knowing where he was going, but desperate to get as far from inevitable pursuit as possible. For a long time, he wandered with no idea of where he might be going, just wanting to put distance between himself and any pursuit. The trees grew thickly in this part of the forest, though, and he feared becoming lost almost as much as discovery by the state soldiers. The sound of a waterfall came to him, and he decided to head there for a drink and to plan his next move. He began walking, then stopped dead in his tracks as an arrow hammered into the tree beside him, and a commanding voice called out, "Hold, friar." A hooded figure materialized, as if by magic from the trees ahead, and by the man's green and brown garb and the strange longbow he carried, Tooke knew him to be an outlaw. The inquisitor looked back over his shoulder, wondering if he should simply head back the way he'd come, but a giant warrior holding a hammer now blocked his path. At first, Tooke feared they would kill him out of hand, but they simply wanted to rob him, and upon realizing he was penniless, took him prisoner, assuming a state inquisitor would fetch a decent ransom. As the outlaws ate a cold meal back at their camp that night, Tooke told them his story. They were skeptical, fearing he might be trying to trick them and bring the law down upon them, but his sincerity finally convinced them to free his bonds. Over time, the friar proved himself in battle, and the outlaws grew to trust him, recognizing his defection and newfound hatred for the state as genuine. He still pays homage to the one God, even if he has rejected all other state tenets and teachings. And he still carries his old incense burner, fashioned now into more easily wielded bludgeoning weapon, the fumes from which bring strength and succor to his allies. For the soldiers in the state keeps, the cloying smell of incense is often the last thing they know in this world.